What's assumed to calculate a bond yield to maturity? A constant reinvestment rate? A flat yield curve? Well, despite the fact that both of those assumptions are often misattributed in the determination of yield to maturity, and despite their seeming plausibility, at least at a superficial level, as we'll see, yield to maturity makes no such assumption. Unfortunately, however, the fact that such assumptions are often claimed reinforces the belief that yield to maturity is a measure of return. Hi, I'm Doug Carroll for InsidersGuideToFinance.com in another of a series of videos that are devoted to trying to explain yield to maturity. And while ultimately we'll talk about what's the right way to conceive of yield to maturity, many of the videos are actually devoted to trying to disabuse people of many of the false assertions that are oftentimes brought up in the discussion of yield to maturity. Before proceeding with a discussion of why the commonly asserted assumptions that are misattributed to yield to maturity are false, and why they can lead to a potential gross misinterpretation of what information is actually contained in the statistic referred to as yield to maturity, it's likely helpful to review the computation itself. Now, as was seen in other videos, yield to maturity is calculated via the same formula as that which prices a bond, which we can refer to as the price yield formula. It is shown in generic form to my left, and what that formula says is the price is the present value of the future cash flows, that is the contractual cash flows, the coupon and principal payments due the bondholder by the terms of the contract over the life of the security, where the present value of those cash flows is found by discounting them by the yield to maturity expressed as a periodic rate, that's the I in the divisor there, or each 1 plus I, 1 plus the yield to maturity expressed as a periodic rate, is raised to a power that reflects the amount of time until the due date of that contractual cash flow. To make the discussion as concrete as possible, let's look at the computation of yield to maturity for an actual bond. Below the generic version of the formula, you now see the formula fleshed out with the price and cash flows for a $100,000 par value, 5.5% coupon bond that matures in exactly 15 years and is currently trading at 88% of its par value. The yield to maturity would be calculated by solving for the value of I. Now, unfortunately, that's not an algebraic computation where somehow you manipulate the formula to separate out a single value of I on one side of the formula and have all known values on the other side and simply perform the operations in the appropriate sequence. The only way to calculate a bond's yield to maturity is via an iterative process. Guess the value of I, given the contractual cash flows and the price. Compute the present value of the cash flows, that is the right-hand side of the formula, based on your assumed value of I. And once you have that, compare to the left-hand side, compare to the price. Well, if based on your guess value of I, the two sides of the equation are equal, then you're done, except you have to annualize the I, multiply the periodic rate by the number of compounding periods in a year. Of course, in the real world, your first guess is not likely to be right, so through a process of trial and error, you keep trying different values of I until you finally guess a value of I that causes the present value of the contractual cash flows to equal the price. Again, then multiplying that by the number of compounding periods per year, you convert the periodic rate to an annual rate, and voila, we have the yield to maturity. That discussion of the iterative process might be a little bit abstract for people not already familiar with it. So let's walk through a couple of iterations that would lead up to the determination of yield to maturity. So again, we have our price yield formula with the contractual cash flows, price, and timing of the cash flows inserted. The only unknown is the value of I, which we need to solve through the iterative process. So let's say the first step in the process was guessing that the bond was trading at a yield to maturity of something like 6%. Well, of course, since it's a semi-annual coupon bond, that would mean a periodic rate of 3. So you'll note in the first iteration of our process, now each of the contractual cash flows, coupon and principal payments to maturity, are discounted by 1.03 raised to the appropriate power. By finding the present value of the cash flows at that guessed discount rate that implies an annual yield, you'll note that we've apparently used too low of a discount rate because we have a present value of the cash flows that's higher than the actual price of 88% of par. Since the present value of the cash flows using that assumed discount rate is above the actual price, that means we've used too low of a discount rate. So we need to try again. Below that, we see another iteration of the process where we've assumed a 7% yield to maturity. In other words, a periodic discount rate of 3.5 or 0.035 in decimal terms. Again, by finding the present value of the cash flows using our new discount rate, we get a present value. But now in this case, we have a present value of the cash flows using that 3.5% periodic discount rate that's below the actual price. In other words, in the second go-round, we've used too high of a discount rate. So that process would be repeated over and over and over again until, through a process of trial and error, we finally found a discount rate that, when applied to find the present value of the cash flows to maturity, generates a present value of the cash flows equal to the price. And then once we have that periodic rate, we need to annualize it to get our annual yield to maturity. And you'll note in this case, rounded to the nearest full basis point, we get a yield to maturity of 6.79%. You'll note in no part of that calculation was there any assumption made about reinvestment rates or the shape of the yield curve. We simply solved for the single value of I, the single periodic discount rate, that caused the present value of the contractual cash flows to equal the price, and then annualize the periodic rate, and that's how you calculate a bond's yield to maturity. So, what are the commonly misattributed assumptions, and why are they incorrect? Because at a superficial level, they sound at least a little bit reasonable, and under special circumstances, that is for bonds with certain characteristics, given those assumptions, the rate of return to maturity would equal the yield to maturity at the time the bond is being purchased. However, as we'll see, that all of those assumptions are really implausible, and that even though one of the assumptions is true in a special circumstance, it's nearly always a mistake to take the outcome in a given scenario and somehow expand that to assume that it applies to all bonds in all circumstances. So before proceeding, it's probably best to state the commonly asserted assumptions that are misattributed to yield to maturity. And though they can take a variety of forms, they boil down to three general statements, and really two of those are simply different variants of one. But let me first review the commonly asserted and misattributed assumptions that are used in the computation of yield to maturity before we knock them down in turn. So first off, yield to maturity assumes a flat yield curve. Second, yield to maturity assumes a constant reinvestment rate. And third, while it's impossible to know the rate of return to maturity on a coupon bond, if all of the periodic coupons were reinvested at a rate exactly equal to the yield to maturity at which a bond was purchased, then the annual return to maturity would equal the quoted yield to maturity at bond's purchase. So what about the first of those three? Yield to maturity assumes a flat yield curve. Well, that really represents a misinterpretation of a single discount rate versus a flat yield curve. And the confusion is maybe understandable at a superficial level, but it's verbal sleight of hand to convert single discount rate to a flat yield curve. Note what was said earlier about the computation of yield to maturity. Solve for the single discount rate that equates the present value of the contractual cash flows over a bond's life to its current price. Now, while one might make the leap of logic that a single discount rate implies a flat yield curve, that's really quite a stretch. Because you'll note that that methodology for computing yield to maturity is assumed regardless of the time to maturity or regardless of the frequency of cash flows. The calculation of yield to maturity is always done the same way regardless of the shape of the yield curve or the level of market interest rates. Again, you're simply solving for a single discount rate. Note that would be true whether a bond paid coupons monthly, quarterly, semi-annually, annually, or for that matter, if there's no cash flows prior to maturity, you're, in other words, a zero coupon bond with all the cash paid out at the bond's maturity, the methodology for calculating yield to maturity is exactly the same. Yield curves imply rates at specified periodicities over some length of time, the length of time covered by the yield curve. And while it might seem reasonable to say, well, a single discount rate is the same as a flat yield curve, no. A flat yield curve implies something about the value of rates at every point along the curve. And yield to maturity, again, makes no assumption about the shape of the yield curve or the level of interest rates. It's simply solving for a single discount rate. Why? Well, of course, that assumption is made so that all market participants would interpret a given yield to maturity mean exactly the same price, and that's why it's based on the contractual cash flows. Perhaps if I frame the issue in a slightly different fashion, it will help clarify at least a little bit. Yield to maturity is the discount rate, or when annualized, the interest rate that expresses the current value of the future cash flows today at a moment in time. As opposed to a yield curve, whether flat or otherwise, a yield curve specifies interest rates that would be appropriate for valuing cash flows having different terms or different times of their payment or receipt. What about the other two assumptions? Well, really, the second and third assumptions identified earlier are different versions of the same idea. The second assumption, misassumption, that yield to maturity assumes a constant reinvestment rate is simply a short form version of the more extended version that yield to maturity would be your rate of return if all the cash flows received over the life of the bond were reinvested at a rate exactly equal to the yield to maturity at which a bond was purchased. Now, of course, oftentimes the short version of the assumption shows, and perhaps it's reading into the mind of the author or speaker to expand yield to maturity assumes a constant reinvestment rate to the more fully fleshed out version. But every time I've encountered the shorter version of those two statements, the implicit assumption always seemed to be that the outcome of the constant reinvestment rate would lead to a rate of return to maturity equal to the yield at which a bond was purchased. Note, those last two assumptions are subject to a mathematical proof. What would happen if all the cash flows over the life of the bond were reinvested at a rate exactly equal to a bond's yield to maturity? Well, if it was an annual pay bond, then the rate of return so projected would equal the yield to maturity at which a bond was purchased. But the vast majority of fixed income securities abroad in the market do not pay annual coupons. And even where a bond pays an annual coupon, assuming a constant reinvestment rate is quite questionable, but let's proceed with the discussion of the error in the assumptions for all but annual pay bonds before we come back to the issue of actual reinvestment rates. So let's calculate the realized rate of return to maturity for our 15-year 5.5% coupon bond, assuming that all the cash flows were reinvested at the yield to maturity of 6.79% that was consistent with the 88% of par price. Well, now to my left is a detailed version of the calculation of the rate of return to maturity given those assumptions. Without reviewing it in detail, the top portion of the exhibit shows what would be the future value of the coupons, that is the coupons plus reinvestment income, if all the $27.50 semi-annual payments were reinvested at a periodic rate equal at that 6.79%. So what I described as the future value of the coupons would be all the coupons plus reinvestment income given the reinvestment assumption just made. Adding to that amount the future value of the principal at maturity, which is just the face amount of the principal. That can be plugged into the rate of return formula as is shown at the bottom of the calculations on the right-hand side of the screen. And you'll note what that would generate is a rate of return to maturity of 6.9%, not 6.79%. So why the difference between the 6.79% yield to maturity and the 6.9% realized rate of return to maturity, again, if all the cash flows were reinvested at a periodic rate equal to the yield to maturity at which the bond was trading at today? Well, it part has to do with the fact that the way we got yield to maturity was taking the periodic rate and annualizing it. And the rate of return that was just calculated is based on a compounding of the periodic yield to maturity. You'll note what's paid out is not a bond's yield to maturity. What's paid out is the periodic coupon. So in part, what leads to a difference between the realized rate of return to maturity given the assumptions and the yield at which a bond was purchased was the way of annualizing yield to maturity. Again, finding the periodic rate and multiplying by the number of periods. Now you might say, oh, but that misses the impact of compounding, which was captured in the 6.9% value that was just determined. And note, for aficionados among you, some might recognize the 6.9% as the effective annual yield. But you'll note the effective annual yield is simply a way of adjusting a yield to maturity for a bond that pays coupons more than once a year to express that on an annual compound basis. Now, some authors reinterpret that as an adjusted yield to maturity, but that's a subject for another video. I don't want to make this one too long, so we'll set that issue aside for the moment. But recall what yield to maturity is designed to do. It's a way of expressing the value of a bond on a rate basis rather than a price basis. It's not a measure of future returns, at least that's not what's really encapsulated in yield to maturity, despite the fact that that's what is often asserted. So what does the yield to maturity calculation actually assume? Go back to the earlier illustration that was included in the video about the determination of yield to maturity, and you'll note it was based on the price and the contractual cash flows. In other words, the only assumption that's actually used in the determination of yield to maturity is no default, i.e. the contractual cash flows are paid in full and in a timely fashion. Now you might say, well, that's a terribly unrealistic assumption for many bonds. Well, I'm not going to say it wouldn't be an unrealistic assumption, especially for a bond currently in default or say a CCC rated bond. But again, the reason for making that assumption is so that all market participants interpret a given yield to maturity to mean exactly the same dollar price. So, while it is true that yield to maturity is oftentimes used as a proxy for future returns, the only thing yield to maturity actually quantifies is the current market value of the bond, but represents it on a rate basis rather than a price basis. Yield to maturity is a way of expressing price in a relative sense. In very general terms, yield to maturity expresses cost of future cash flows in terms of what you're paying today relative to the amount of cash flows you're going to receive in the future. Now that's a very big issue, and that will be the subject of future videos. I might end up having to do 3 or 4 videos to try to make that issue as clear as possible. But to wrap up the discussion of the assumptions implicit in yield to maturity, is there some way that the misassumptions that we described earlier could be stated in a way that made them relatively accurate? Well, they could, but that doesn't mean they're all that insightful. I would contend that they could be restated as that if you want to interpret yield to maturity as a rate of return, you have to assume a constant reinvestment rate to maturity, or a yield curve that would be flat and unchanging over the time to maturity. Clearly stated in those fashions, even if now technically correct, with allowances for differences in compounding frequency and annual returns. How insightful are those statements, even if accurate now? How sensible would it be to assume a constant reinvestment rate over any protracted period of time? Given the variability, indeed great volatility of interest rates over time, I would contend that any investment concept premised on constant interest rates or a flat and stable yield curve give almost no insight into the investment merits of securities, nor would they provide a very good frame of analysis for assessing future prospects for fixed income investment. I hope you enjoyed this video. You can go to our YouTube channel or Facebook page to see other videos on a range of investment-related topics. Or you can go to the website, insidersguidetofinance.com. At our website, in addition to the free video shorts, there are a series of modestly priced, in-depth training videos with running times of approximately 1 hour each that go into a number of subjects in greater detail. The website and Facebook page also contain information about open enrollment programs I will be presenting over the next few months, and my recently released book, The Insider's Guide to Fixed Income Securities and Markets.